In the late 1930s, America did not feel like a confident superpower. It felt anxious. The Great Depression had cracked the idea that the system was unbreakable. Millions had lost jobs, savings, dignity. Trust in institutions was thin. Faith in the future felt abstract. People were listening more than they were thinking. Listening to radios, to strong voices, to anyone who sounded certain in an uncertain world. Across the country, crowds were gathering, not in secret basements, not in remote compounds, but in public halls, city parks, and eventually under the bright lights of America's most famous arenas. There were flags, order, uniforms, applause that came on cue. There was a feeling many in the crowd hadn't felt in years: belonging. No one called it a cult. It didn't look like one. At least not the way people imagined cults were supposed to look. There were no robed mystics, no hidden temples, no whispered prophecies. Everything happened in plain sight, wrapped in the language of patriotism, discipline, and national renewal. This was not about faith in God. It was about faith in structure, in hierarchy, in a leader who promised clarity where democracy felt slow and confusing. And that was the danger. Because history shows that cults don't always arrive as something foreign or strange. Sometimes they arrive speaking the local language, using familiar symbols, insisting they are simply offering order in a chaotic world. By the time the American government understood what it was looking at, tens of thousands were already marching, saluting, and pledging loyalty. Not just to ideas, but to a movement that demanded obedience above all else. This is the story of how a modern democracy discovered that even freedom has blind spots, how fear can turn politics into ritual, and how the United States, on the eve of World War II, was forced to shut down a movement that had crossed an invisible line, from opinion into cult. In the years after the stock market crash of 1929, the United States entered a psychological crisis as much as an economic one. By 1933, nearly 1 in 4 Americans was unemployed. Banks collapsed. Breadlines stretched through city blocks. The promise that hard work guaranteed stability had quietly died. For many, democracy began to feel less like a safeguard and more like noise. Political debates sounded abstract when rent was overdue. Institutions moved slowly, while desperation moved fast. People didn't just want solutions. They wanted certainty. And certainty, history shows, is fertile ground for movements that speak in absolutes. The federal government under Franklin D. Roosevelt responded with sweeping reforms. The New Deal reshaped the American state, expanding federal power in ways unseen before. For some, it offered hope. For others, it confirmed a fear that the country they knew was slipping away. This split mattered, because moments of transition, when systems are visibly changing, are moments when identity becomes unstable. And when identity becomes unstable, people look for something firm to hold on to. Across the Atlantic, Europe was already on fire. Authoritarian regimes presented themselves as disciplined, decisive, orderly. American newspapers reported on massive rallies, synchronized crowds, and leaders who seemed to command absolute loyalty. To many observers, it looked unsettling. To others, it looked efficient. Inside the United States, small groups began to echo the same language. Not openly at first, not loudly, but persistently. They spoke of strength, unity, and national revival. They framed democracy as weak not because it was unjust, but because it was indecisive. Too many voices, too much debate, too little action. What they offered instead was simple: belonging. Belonging does not require deep political understanding. It requires emotion, ritual, repetition, symbols that make people feel part of something larger than themselves. Uniforms served that purpose well. They erased difference. They flattened individuality. When everyone looks the same, doubt becomes harder to express. standing in a crowd, dressed alike, moving together, chanting together. Individuals begin to experience what psychologists later called de-individuation, the loss of personal accountability inside a collective identity. This was not accidental. Organizations that later drew government attention understood something essential about human behavior. People obey more readily when obedience feels shared, when hesitation becomes socially costly, when enthusiasm is rewarded and silence is suspicious. Meetings were carefully staged. Order was emphasized. Speakers spoke not as politicians, but as interpreters of reality. Men who claimed to see through chaos into a hidden truth others had missed. Their message was not complex. Complexity breeds questions. Their message was emotional, moral, and absolute. You were either part of the movement or you were confused, manipulated, or blind. That framing mattered more than any specific policy position. Because once a movement divides the world into clarity and corruption, loyalty stops being optional. It becomes a measure of worth. Importantly, none of this required secrecy. The gatherings were public. Flyers were distributed openly. Families attended events together. Children were present. This visibility created a sense of legitimacy. If something happens in the open, many assume it must be acceptable. That assumption delayed alarm. Federal authorities were watching, but cautiously. The United States had strong protections for speech and assembly. Investigations moved slowly, constrained by law and precedent. At this stage, the movement could still plausibly claim it was simply another political organization exercising constitutional rights. But internally, something else was taking shape. Hierarchy hardened. Loyalty tests emerged. The language of devotion intensified. Leaders stopped describing their organization as one option among many, and began describing it as the only movement capable of restoring national dignity. That shift, subtle but decisive, is where politics begins to transform into something else. Not belief, not ideology, but ritualized obedience. By the late 1930s, the stage was set. Economic fear had softened resistance. International tension heightened emotions, and a movement that thrived on structure, symbolism, and discipline was preparing to step into the spotlight. Soon, it would do so in a way that made ignoring it impossible. By 1936, what had once been scattered sympathies and informal gatherings began to harden into a structured organization. It called itself the German-American Bund, and it insisted, publicly, that it was nothing more than a cultural and patriotic association for Americans of German descent. On paper, the claim sounded harmless. The Bund registered offices, printed newsletters, organized picnics, and held meetings that resembled political rallies more than secret conclaves. It spoke the language of civic participation, discipline, and national pride. Its leaders were careful with words. They avoided explicit declarations that might trigger legal scrutiny. Everything was framed as lawful, orderly, and American. But structure tells a deeper story than slogans. The Bund was not flat. It was hierarchical. Authority flowed downward, not outward. Local chapters reported to regional leaders, who answered to a centralized command. Decisions were not debated. They were delivered. Loyalty was not assumed. It was tested. Members were expected to attend meetings regularly. Absence raised questions. Disagreement raised suspicions. Over time, participation became less about ideas and more about visibility. Being seen, being present, being counted. Uniforms reinforced that logic. They were not costumes. They were tools. Wearing the same clothing created instant belonging and instant pressure. When everyone around you looks identical, standing apart becomes psychologically expensive. In such environments, silence feels safer than dissent. Children were included as well. Youth programs emphasized discipline, physical training, and respect for authority. Activities were framed as character-building and wholesome. Parents were told they were giving their children structure in a chaotic world. Few stopped to ask what kind of structure it was, or who defined it. Ritual played a central role. Meetings followed predictable patterns. Flags were displayed. Speeches were delivered from elevated stages. Applause came at expected moments. The repetition mattered. Ritual reduces complexity. It turns participation into muscle memory. Over time, members no longer ask why things are done a certain way. They simply do them. This is a key marker of cultic behavior, the replacement of reflection with routine. Leadership encouraged a sense of external hostility, not always explicit, not always named, but constantly implied. Members were told they were misunderstood, misrepresented, surrounded by forces that wanted to weaken the nation. Criticism from journalists or officials was framed not as disagreement, but as proof that the movement was dangerous to corrupt elites. That framing served a purpose. When followers believe criticism confirms righteousness, accountability disappears. Every warning becomes evidence of persecution. Every investigation becomes validation. The Bund's public messaging insisted on loyalty to the United States. American flags were prominent at events. References to the Constitution were frequent. This visual patriotism created cognitive cover. To outsiders, it blurred lines. To insiders, it resolved tension. They did not see themselves as opposing the country. They saw themselves as saving it. Behind that narrative stood a single figure. By the late 1930s, the organization had rallied around Fritz Kuhn, a German-born naturalized American citizen who styled himself not merely as an administrator, but as the embodiment of the movement's purpose. Kuhn understood performance. He spoke in absolutes. He mocked uncertainty. He framed compromise as weakness. His speeches were not policy lectures. They were emotional affirmations. He told his audiences who they were, why they mattered, and why history was on their side. This is how cult leaders operate. They do not invite followers to think. They invite them to feel. Certainty feels like relief when the world is unstable. Being told you are right, unequivocally, feels like dignity restored. Kuhn demanded loyalty, not just to the organization, but to himself as its interpreter. Internal disputes were settled from the top. Dissent was quietly pushed out. Over time, leadership became personalized. Criticizing the leader meant criticizing the movement. Criticizing the movement meant betraying the cause. That fusion is another warning sign. By 1938, the Bund claimed tens of thousands of members nationwide, with chapters in major cities and rural areas alike. Estimates varied, but law enforcement agencies began paying closer attention. The movement was no longer marginal. It was visible, confident, expanding. Yet its most dramatic moment was still ahead. A moment designed not just to energize followers, but to demonstrate power. In February 1939, the Bund announced a rally in New York City. The venue was not obscure. It was not hidden. It was one of the most recognizable public spaces in the country, Madison Square Garden. The choice was deliberate. Holding a mass gathering there sent a message. This movement was not afraid. It believed it belonged at the center of American public life. And it believed the spectacle itself would legitimize its existence. What unfolded inside that arena would force the nation to confront a question it had avoided for too long. At what point does a political movement stop being protected expression and become a threat created by its own rituals of obedience? On the evening of February 20th, 1939, New York City was cold, restless, and alert. Police presence around Midtown was heavier than usual. By early evening, crowds were already forming, some moving toward the arena, others gathering outside in protest. Inside, nearly 20,000 people filled the seats. The setting was carefully designed. A massive stage dominated the floor. American flags hung prominently. arranged to create a sense of legitimacy and national belonging. Ushers and guards maintained order with military precision. Every detail, lighting, placement, timing, had been rehearsed. This was not a spontaneous rally, it was a ceremony. When Fritz Kuhn took the stage, the response was immediate and coordinated. Applause rose in waves, not bursts. Chants followed familiar rhythms. The audience knew when to react, when to stand, when to fall silent. That synchronization was the point. Sociologists later noted that mass gatherings like this function less as political forums and more as emotional amplifiers. Individuals do not attend to evaluate ideas. They attend to feel absorbed by something larger than themselves. That night, the feeling was power. Speeches framed the movement as misunderstood, but righteous, disciplined but peaceful, firm where others were weak. The rhetoric avoided policy specifics. Instead, it focused on identity, who belonged, who was loyal, who truly cared about the nation's future. Outside the building, the contrast was sharp. Thousands of protesters gathered, chanting warnings, holding signs, trying to draw attention to what they believed was unfolding inside. Clashes broke out. Police struggled to keep the two crowds apart. At least one protester was forcibly removed from the arena after rushing the stage, an incident widely photographed and later published in newspapers across the country. Those images mattered, because for the first time, the event could not be dismissed as marginal. It was no longer a question of obscure meetings or isolated chapters. This was a mass spectacle, staged at the symbolic heart of American public life, broadcast through photographs and reports nationwide. The reaction was immediate. Newspapers across the political spectrum expressed alarm, not just at the content of the speeches, but at the scale and discipline of the event. Editorials questioned how such a gathering had been allowed. Commentators asked whether existing laws were sufficient to address organizations that operated openly while cultivating internal practices that resembled total obedience. Federal agencies intensified their scrutiny. Files that had once been thin grew thick. Financial records were examined. Internal correspondence was monitored. Investigators focused less on what the movement claimed to believe, and more on how it operated. Its command structure, its loyalty demands, its treatment of dissent. That distinction was crucial. The United States could not, and would not, criminalize belief, but it could act against fraud, coercion, and organizations that blurred the line between civic participation and enforced allegiance. Within months, the facade began to crack. Evidence emerged that Fritz Kuhn had misused organizational funds for personal expenses. Charges followed. In December 1939, Kuhn was convicted of embezzlement and sentenced to prison. The leader who had presented himself as the embodiment of discipline was exposed as corrupt. The effect on the movement was devastating. Cults depend on the perceived moral authority of their leaders. When that authority collapses, loyalty fractures, attendance dropped. Internal conflicts intensified. Chapters began to dissolve. Then, history accelerated. In 1941, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States entered World War II. Overnight, the context changed completely. Organizations that had once operated in legal gray zones were now viewed through the lens of national security. The German-American Bund disbanded soon after. Its camps were closed. Its remaining leaders were detained or deported. What had presented itself as a patriotic movement vanished almost as quickly as it had risen. But disappearance did not mean irrelevance, because the story left behind a warning that extended far beyond its specific time and place. It showed how easily democratic openness can be used as camouflage, how rituals can replace reasoning, how loyalty, when elevated above accountability, becomes dangerous. The Bund did not seize power. It did not overturn the system. But it revealed something unsettling, that even in a society built on freedom, the mechanics of a cult can take root, quietly, legally, and in plain sight. The question was never whether America survived that moment. The question was whether it recognized it in time. The collapse of the German-American Bund did not happen in a single dramatic moment. It unfolded through paperwork, courtrooms, surveillance reports, and legal procedures. Slow, deliberate processes that lacked the theatrical intensity of rallies but carried far greater consequences. This, too, was part of the story. American authorities understood that the danger posed by the Bund was not ideological in the narrow sense. The United States had long tolerated radical opinions, fringe movements, and unpopular beliefs. What alarmed investigators was something more subtle: the way the organization functioned internally and the degree of control it exerted over its members. Federal agencies began reframing the problem. Instead of asking, "What do they believe?" they asked, "How do they operate?" Instead of debating ideas, they traced command structures, funding streams, and disciplinary mechanisms. At the center of this effort stood J. Edgar Hoover, who had led the Federal Bureau of Investigation since 1924. Hoover was deeply concerned with organizations that blurred the line between political activism and enforced obedience. His fear was not revolution in the streets, but subversion through legitimacy, movements that used the protections of democracy to undermine its foundations from within. Under his direction, investigators compiled detailed profiles of Bund leadership. They tracked communications between chapters. They documented attendance patterns. They analyzed how authority was exercised and how dissent was suppressed. The resulting picture looked less like a civic association and more like a closed system of loyalty, insulated from external correction. One of the most revealing aspects was financial control. Membership dues were mandatory. Donations were strongly encouraged. Funds flowed upward, not outward. Decisions about spending were centralized. Members were rarely informed how their contributions were used. Financial opacity, investigators knew, was a common feature of cult-like organizations. It created dependency, obedience, and vulnerability. The case against Fritz Kuhn did not hinge on ideology. It hinged on fraud. Evidence showed that Kuhn had diverted organizational funds for personal use, luxury travel, expensive clothing, and extramarital affairs. The contrast between his public image of discipline and his private conduct was stark. In court, this mattered. Embezzlement was tangible. It could be proven. It could be punished. When Kuhn was convicted in December 1939 and sentenced to prison, the symbolic damage was immediate. Followers who had accepted his authority as moral and absolute were forced to confront a contradiction they could not easily explain away. This is another pattern seen repeatedly in cults. As long as the leader's authority appears unchallenged, contradictions are rationalized, failures are reframed, criticism is dismissed. But when authority collapses under indisputable evidence, loyalty becomes unstable. The spell weakens. Inside the Bund, fractures widened. Competing figures attempted to seize control. Local chapters argued over direction. Attendance dropped. Financial contributions slowed. Without the unifying presence of a charismatic leader, ritual lost its force. Meanwhile, the broader environment was changing rapidly. By 1940, war in Europe had expanded. American newspapers reported daily on invasions, bombings, and the collapse of states that had once seemed permanent. Public tolerance for movements associated, rightly or wrongly, with foreign authoritarian systems declined sharply. What had once been dismissed as eccentric or fringe now appeared dangerous. Government response escalated accordingly. Camps operated by the Bund were closed. Properties were seized. Remaining leaders were questioned, detained, or deported under existing immigration laws. The organization formally disbanded in 1941, shortly before the United States entered World War II. Importantly, this dissolution did not require the suspension of constitutional protections. It did not involve mass arrests of ordinary members. The state acted through existing legal frameworks, fraud statutes, immigration enforcement, and national security provisions. This restraint was intentional. American officials were acutely aware that overreaction could create martyrs. It could confirm narratives of persecution. It could validate the very grievances cult-like movements depend on to survive. The objective was not to suppress belief, but to dismantle structures of coercion. Once dismantled, the movement collapsed with surprising speed. Within months, it ceased to exist as a coordinated entity. Its camps fell silent. Its publications stopped printing. Its symbols faded from public view. Many former members simply returned to private life, unwilling to speak about their involvement. Silence, too, was a consequence. In the years that followed, the Bund became an uncomfortable footnote in American history. It did not fit neatly into narratives of national unity or moral clarity. It was easier to forget than to analyze, easier to treat as an anomaly than as a warning. But forgetting came at a cost. Because the Bund was never the most dangerous example of political extremism in American history. It was, however, one of the clearest demonstrations of how cult mechanics can operate inside an open society without immediately triggering alarms. The mechanics are consistent. First comes uncertainty, economic, social, psychological. Then comes a promise of clarity. Then comes structure, ritual, discipline. Then comes loyalty elevated above accountability. At that point, belief becomes secondary. What matters is obedience. This is why the Bund matters beyond its specific ideology or era. It shows that the threat to democratic societies does not always arrive through violence or coups. Sometimes it arrives through uniforms, ceremonies, and the quiet normalization of submission. The most unsettling aspect is how ordinary many participants were. They were not criminals. They were not isolated fanatics. They were families, workers, parents, veterans, people responding to fear and instability with a desire for order. The movement did not recruit monsters. It recruited humans. That fact challenges comforting assumptions. It suggests that resilience against cultic movements does not lie solely in intelligence or education. It lies in maintaining institutions that can absorb dissent without surrendering authority, and in fostering skepticism toward any movement that demands loyalty before transparency. By the end of the war, the German-American Bund had vanished. But the questions it raised did not. How does a democracy protect itself without betraying its principles? How much tolerance is too much? And how can a society recognize when politics stops being debate and becomes ritual? These questions have no permanent answers. They must be asked again and again, in different contexts, with different faces. Because the danger the Bund represented was never uniquely American, or uniquely tied to one moment in history. It was human. The question that lingered after the German-American Bund disappeared was not whether the United States had acted decisively enough. By legal standards, it had. The organization was dismantled without mass repression, without emergency laws, without abandoning constitutional norms. The deeper question was more uncomfortable. Why had it been possible at all? The answer lies not in ideology, but in environment. The United States of the late 1930s was a society under strain. Economic trauma had eroded trust. Rapid social change had unsettled identities. International events created a sense that history was accelerating, leaving ordinary people behind. In such conditions, democratic processes, slow, argumentative, procedural, can feel inadequate. Authoritarian movements exploit that feeling, but they are not alone. Any structure that promises certainty, discipline, and belonging can become attractive when uncertainty dominates daily life. The Bund did not invent these needs. It organized them. It gave them form, symbols, schedules, and a hierarchy that transformed anxiety into purpose. What made the situation uniquely American was the openness of the system itself. Freedom of assembly allowed public gatherings. Freedom of speech allowed radical rhetoric. Freedom of association allowed disciplined organizations to form without immediate suspicion. These freedoms were not mistakes. They were foundational principles. But they also created blind spots. The Bund operated within those blind spots. It did not begin with violence. It did not announce revolutionary intent. It framed itself as lawful, orderly, and patriotic. That framing delayed resistance. Many assumed that if something were truly dangerous, it would announce itself more clearly. History rarely works that way. Dangerous movements often present themselves as solutions, not threats. They speak of renewal, not destruction. They promise restoration, not upheaval. They demand loyalty gradually, normalizing obedience step by step until resistance feels abnormal. The Bund's leaders understood this intuitively. They invested less in persuasion and more in ritual, less in debate and more in spectacle. They replaced argument with atmosphere. Over time, atmosphere did the work ideology usually does. The government's eventual response reflected an important lesson. Authorities did not attempt to criminalize belief. They targeted behavior, fraud, coercion, deception, abuse of trust. They focused on leadership accountability, financial transparency, and legal compliance. This approach avoided validating claims of persecution while dismantling the mechanisms that sustained the movement. It was a narrow path, and it required patience, but it worked. The Bund collapsed, not because its ideas were debated out of existence, but because its structure could not survive scrutiny. Once exposed to law, leadership failed. Once leadership failed, loyalty dissolved. Without loyalty, ritual became empty. What remained was silence. For decades, the episode received little attention. It complicated national myths. It suggested vulnerability rather than certainty. It reminded Americans that democracy is not immune to the dynamics it criticizes elsewhere. Yet this silence also carried a warning. Forgetting how easily cult-like movements can emerge invites repetition. Not in identical form, not with identical symbols, but with familiar patterns. The patterns endure. A charismatic leader who claims exclusive insight. A disciplined organization that discourages dissent. Rituals that replace reflection. Criticism reframed as proof of righteousness. Loyalty elevated above accountability. These are not relics of the 1930s. They are features of human behavior under pressure. The story of the German-American Bund is not primarily about a failed movement. It is about a moment when a society glimpsed its own fragility and chose, quietly, to correct course. No monuments mark the decision. No victory parades commemorate it. No clear ending signals closure. That may be the most instructive part. Democracies do not always defeat threats with dramatic confrontations. Sometimes they survive by noticing patterns early, responding proportionally, and refusing to confuse spectacle with legitimacy. In February 1939, thousands gathered under bright lights, convinced they were witnessing strength. Within 2 years, the movement that staged that spectacle no longer existed. What endured was the lesson. Politics becomes dangerous, not when it inspires passion, but when it demands submission. Movements become cults not when they hold opinions, but when they replace judgment with ritual. And freedom remains fragile, not because people reject it, but because, in moments of fear, they may trade it for certainty without realizing the cost. History does not repeat itself exactly, but it does recognize familiar shapes. The question is never whether those shapes will appear again. The question is whether we will recognize them in time.